A mother walks into the cold, silent morgue, her heart shattered by grief. But what she discovers inside will leave you speechless. You won't believe what happens next. Stay until the end to see the moment that changed everything. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Gina sat quietly in the living room, her hands resting on her growing belly as her youngest child, Mia, played with her toys on the carpet nearby. A soft hum of cartoons filled the room, creating a peaceful background for a moment that Gina had grown to cherish. Her husband, Stephen, walked in with a warm smile, carrying a tray of fresh fruit. "You've got to keep your strength up, babe," he said, placing the tray on the coffee table in front of her. She smiled, grateful for his care. This was her 5th pregnancy, and while it wasn't as physically demanding as the first, the weight of motherhood was heavier now. With 4 children already running around the house, the thought of another baby was both exciting and nerve-wracking. This time it was a girl. They had already picked out a name, Linda, a beautiful, strong name that carried hope and joy. Gina and Stephen had spent weeks preparing the nursery, folding baby clothes and stacking diapers, imagining the day they would bring their little girl home. Everything was going according to plan, but life has a way of changing plans when you least expect it. Late that night, Gina woke up to a sharp pain in her abdomen. It wasn't the usual discomfort of pregnancy. This was something different. Her heart raced as she sat up, breathing heavily, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. "Stephen," she said, nudging him with a trembling hand. "Stephen, wake up. Something's wrong." He jolted awake, instantly alert. "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" Gina nodded, her face tight with discomfort. Her breathing had become more labored, and every few seconds she winced from the sharp cramps in her stomach. "Get the bag," she said through gritted teeth. "We need to go to the hospital, now." Stephen jumped out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed the hospital bag they had packed weeks ago just in case and rushed to the front door. Gina followed slowly, her steps unsteady as the pain intensified. Her 4 children stood at the top of the stairs, rubbing their eyes with sleepy confusion. "Mommy, are you okay?" asked her son Elijah, his little voice filled with concern. "I'm okay, baby," she said, trying to sound calm. "Go back to bed. Mommy just needs to see the doctor." The drive to the hospital was tense. Rain splattered against the windshield and the wipers moved in a frantic rhythm. Gina gripped the armrest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind was a storm of fear and prayer. "Please, God, not now, not like this," she whispered to herself. Stephen drove as fast as he could without breaking the speed limit, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. "Hold on, Gina. We're almost there," he reassured her, but his voice shook with barely hidden fear. When they arrived at the hospital, the emergency room lights were harsh and cold. Nurses in blue scrubs rushed toward them with a wheelchair. Gina was quickly escorted to the maternity ward, her heart pounding louder than the beeping monitors around her. 27 weeks? The nurse asked, glancing at Gina's chart. "Yes," Stephen replied. The nurse's eyes shifted with concern, but she masked it with a professional nod. "We'll take care of her," she said, and they wheeled Gina into a delivery room. Everything happened so fast after that. The pain grew unbearable, and Gina could barely process the voices of doctors and nurses moving around her. Words like preterm labor and emergency delivery echoed in her ears, blending with the sound of her own heartbeat. Tears streamed down her face as she fought to stay focused, but the pain was too intense. Her body felt like it was being torn in half. "Breathe, Gina, breathe for me," a nurse said, her voice calm but firm. Gina tried, but her breathing came in short, broken gasps. "She's crowning," the doctor announced. Gina pushed with every ounce of strength she had left, her face contorted with pain and determination. Then, suddenly, it was over. The room was still, eerily quiet. No cries, no sound of a baby breathing. Gina's heart dropped. "Why can't I hear her? Why isn't she crying?" she asked, her voice frantic. She strained her neck to see her baby, but the nurses had already surrounded the infant, their movements quick and calculated. The nurse placed the tiny baby on a warming table, rubbing her chest with a towel. "Come on, baby girl, breathe for me," she said softly, but her voice was tense. More nurses arrived. One of them called for the neonatal specialist. Gina's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone to give her answers. "What's happening? Is she okay? Tell me she's okay," she cried out, tears streaming down her face. No one answered. Stephen stood at her side, gripping her hand tightly, his jaw clenched in fear and helplessness. Minutes passed like hours. The neonatal specialist arrived, his face unreadable as he assessed the situation. He pressed his stethoscope against Linda's tiny chest, his brow furrowing. He shook his head. "No pulse, no respiratory effort," he said flatly, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Time of death, 3:22 a.m. Gina's world shattered. She shook her head violently, as if denying reality would change it. "No, no, check again," she pleaded, her voice rising to a scream. "She's not gone. She can't be gone." Her entire body shook with sobs, her cries raw and unrestrained. Stephen's eyes welled up with tears, but he stayed silent, his arm wrapped around his wife, trying to hold her together as she fell apart. A nurse approached them, her face heavy with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. Gina felt numb. The nurses carefully wrapped Linda in a soft white cloth, her tiny face barely visible beneath the fabric. They placed her in a small wooden box, a makeshift casket for a life that had barely begun. "You can hold her if you'd like," the nurse said, but Gina shook her head. She couldn't do it. She couldn't bear the thought of holding her daughter like that. They brought the paperwork, a death certificate. Her name was already printed on it. Linda Harris. Born April 7th, 2019. Time of death, 3:22 a.m. Cause of death, prematurity. Gina stared at the paper, unable to process the words. "How is she gone?" she whispered. "She was just here. She was just here with me." Her mind spiraled with grief, disbelief, and unbearable pain. Stephen signed the paper with shaken hands, his eyes never lifting from the paper. As the nurses wheeled Linda's small body to the morgue, Gina sat in silence. Her hands rested on her empty belly, and her eyes stayed fixed on the door where they had taken her baby. Her chest rose and fell with slow, shallow breaths. She had carried Linda for 27 weeks, loved her before she even saw her face. And now, in a matter of moments, she was gone. "She's really gone," Gina whispered, the weight of those words finally crashing down on her like a wave. Stephen knelt in front of her, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Gina," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." She leaned forward, her face buried in his chest as they both sobbed together. No words, no answers. Just pain. Hours passed like a blur. The sun had risen, but its warmth didn't reach them. Gina sat in her hospital bed, eyes hollow and face pale. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. Her heart ached with the unbearable pain of loss. Then, like a whisper in her mind, she felt it. A pull, a quiet, persistent feeling she couldn't ignore. "I need to see her," she said suddenly, her voice hoarse but steady. Stephen looked at her, confused. "What?" "I need to see her. I need to see my baby," she said, her eyes hard with resolve. "I have to see her one more time." Her voice carried a weight of certainty that even Stephen couldn't question. He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice shaky but certain. "Okay, let's go see her." With the help of a nurse, Gina stood on unsteady legs, her body still weak from labor. Together, she and Stephen prepared to go to the morgue, to see their daughter one last time. Neither of them knew that what they were about to find would change their lives forever. Gina sat silently in the wheelchair as a nurse pushed her down the cold, sterile hallway toward the hospital morgue. Her body still ached from labor, but the pain in her heart was far worse. Her hands fidgeted with the fabric of the hospital gown, her eyes fixed straight ahead, hollow and distant. Beside her, Stephen walked with slow, heavy steps, his head bowed, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Their grief was a storm too loud to be drowned out by words. The hallway seemed endless. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering faintly, casting a cold, pale glow on the white-tiled floors. Every sound echoed unnervingly. The soft squeak of the wheelchair's wheels, the clicking of the nurse's footsteps, the distant beep of hospital monitors far behind them. Each second felt like a century. Gina's heart was a drumbeat of dread, louder and louder with every push of the wheelchair. Her brother, Malcolm, was already waiting at the door of the morgue. He leaned against the wall, his face tight with pain, his eyes red from crying. When he saw them coming, he straightened up and wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. He forced himself to stand strong, his gaze shifting from Gina to Stephen, silently offering them strength he barely had himself. "Y'all ready for this?" Malcolm asked, his voice low and shaky. He looked straight at Gina, searching her face for doubt. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the door in front of her. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'm ready." But she wasn't. How could anyone be ready for something like this? Her daughter, her little Linda, was behind that door, lying cold and still, wrapped in white cloth like she was nothing more than a fragile doll. The nurse swiped her badge against the scanner, and with a soft beep, the heavy metal door unlocked with a click. A rush of cold air met them as it slid open, biting at their skin. The room smelled of steel, antiseptic, and something faintly sweet like old flowers. Gina's stomach twisted as they rolled inside. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Her hands clutched the sides of the wheelchair so hard her knuckles turned white. Rows of silver storage drawers lined the walls, each one large enough to hold a person. Her eyes darted from drawer to drawer, her chest tightening with every glance. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her lungs. She didn't belong here. None of them did. Her baby didn't belong here. The nurse glanced at a clipboard, scanned the labels on the drawers, and stopped at one near the bottom. "Here," she said softly, her eyes filled with quiet sympathy. "Do you want me to open it, or would you like to do it yourself?" the nurse asked, looking from Gina to Stephen. Stephen glanced at Gina, his face uncertain, but Gina didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said firmly. Her voice was shaky, but there was strength in it too. The nurse nodded, stepping aside to give Gina space. With a deep breath, Gina leaned forward, bracing her feet against the cold tile. Her fingers gripped the handle of the drawer. The metal was cold and unwelcoming. Her heart pounded in her chest like thunder, her breath short and sharp. Slowly she pulled. The drawer slid out with a soft metallic hum, revealing the small, simple wooden box inside. Her breath caught in her throat. The box was so small, too small, it didn't feel real. It felt like a bad dream, like something that could only happen in nightmares. But it was real. Her heart told her it was real. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, and she blinked rapidly, trying to clear them. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing lightly over the smooth wood. She stared at it for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. "Go ahead, sis," Malcolm said softly behind her. "We're right here with you." Gina glanced back at him, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw his pain reflected in his eyes, and that gave her the strength she needed. She turned back to the small box and, with trembling fingers, lifted the lid. Her breath hitched. The first thing she saw was white fabric, neatly wrapped around a tiny, still form. She reached forward slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the cloth. Her heart clenched so hard she thought it might stop. Slowly, she pulled back the fabric, revealing the small, soft face beneath. Her daughter, Linda. Her cheeks were plump, her lips slightly parted as if she had fallen asleep mid-sentence. Her tiny eyelashes lay like feathers against her smooth brown skin. Her head was so small, so delicate. Gina's hands hovered above her face, unsure whether to touch her or not. "She looks like she's sleeping," Gina whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Her tears finally spilled over, streaming down her face like rain. "My baby," she sobbed, "my sweet baby girl." Her voice cracked as she reached out and gently cupped Linda's face. It was cold, colder than she expected. Her thumb brushed against Linda's cheek, tracing the soft curve of it. Her eyes squeezed shut as a sob racked her body, and she pressed her forehead to the edge of the drawer, letting her grief consume her. Stephen knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Malcolm placed a hand on her back, his head bowed, his own tears falling freely. They stayed that way for a while, a family wrapped in grief, mourning a life that ended before it had truly begun. Gina lifted her head, her eyes puffy and red. She took a deep breath, wiped her face with her sleeve, and looked back down at Linda. Her fingers brushed over her daughter's tiny hands. "I just need a picture," she said quietly. I just want to remember her." Stephen hesitated. "Are you sure, Gina?" "I'm sure," she said with a shaky nod. I have to remember her." She pulled her phone from the pocket of her hospital gown, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately. She opened the camera app, her hands trembling as she lined up the shot. The camera clicked softly as she captured the image. She took one more, then another. Each photo was like a piece of her heart she could keep forever. Her breathing slowed as she lowered the phone, gazing down at her daughter one last time. Her fingers reached for the white cloth, ready to pull it back over Linda's face. But then it happened. A sound, faint, barely there. Gina froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Her eyes darted to Linda's face, and her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, unsure if she was imagining it. But then she heard it again. A soft, weak cry. Her eyes widened, her mouth fallen open in disbelief. Her heart stopped, then started again, pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of her chest. She leaned in, her face inches from Linda's. Her daughter's eyes twitched. Her chest rose just a little, barely noticeable, but it was there. A breath. A small, shallow breath. "No," Gina whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no, no." Her eyes filled with tears. Her hands flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her. "She's alive! She's alive!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. Stephen! Malcolm! She's breathing! Look at her! She's breathing! Malcolm's eyes went wide with shock. Stephen stumbled back, his eyes locked on his daughter. For a moment, no one moved. They all just stood there, staring at the impossible sight in front of them. Then Malcolm broke free of the shock. "Move!" he barked. "Move! We gotta get her to the NICU now!" He reached into the drawer, carefully lifting Linda's fragile body in his arms. Her chest moved again. Another shallow breath. Her tiny eyes flickered just for a moment before closing again. "She's breathing," Malcolm said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's really breathing." "Run!" Gina screamed, already on her feet. Her legs were weak, but she didn't care. "Go! Take her now!" Stephen was already sprinting toward the door, Malcolm close behind him, holding Linda close to his chest. The nurse hit the emergency button, and alarms blared through the halls as the family ran. Gina stumbled after them, her breath ragged, her heart pounding with a mix of terror and hope. "Hold on, baby," she sobbed. "Hold on, Linda. Hold on." The blaring sound of the emergency alarm echoed through the hospital corridors as Malcolm sprinted toward the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, with Linda cradled tightly in his arms. Each step felt like a race against time. Gina stumbled behind him, her hospital gown clinging to her as her feet shuffled against the cold tile floors. Her breath was short and shallow, her heart pounding like a war drum. Stephen ran beside her, glancing back every few seconds to make sure she was still moving. "Keep going, Gina," he shouted, his voice strained with urgency. "We're almost there, just a little further." Gina's legs burned with each step, her body still weak from labor, but she refused to stop. Her eyes stayed locked on Linda, her tiny body wrapped in Malcolm's hoodie. She watched the gentle rise and fall of Linda's chest, each breath a fragile promise of life. "Don't you stop, baby girl," Gina whispered between ragged breaths. "Mommy's right here. We're right here with you." Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't dare wipe them away. She had to see her baby, every single second of it. The doors to the NICU swung open as a nurse held them back, her face a mask of shock and confusion. "What happened?" the nurse shouted, rushing toward them. "Is that a baby? Is she breathing?" Malcolm's voice was rough, hoarse from yelling. "She's breathing. She's alive. Get the doctors now." The nurse didn't ask any more questions. She pressed a button on the wall, and her voice boomed through the intercom. "Code Blue, NICU, immediate assistance required, Code Blue." The calm, sterile atmosphere of the NICU shattered into chaos. Doctors and nurses poured into the room like a flood. Hands reached for Linda. Malcolm reluctantly released her into the arms of a nurse, his face twisted in fear and disbelief. "Be careful with her," he barked. "She's fragile." The nurse gave him a quick nod before gently placing Linda on a small, heated table. The bright overhead lights illuminated her tiny body, revealing the pale brown tone of her skin and the faint twitch of her tiny fingers. "Heart rate is low but steady," said one of the nurses, her eyes glued to the monitor. "She's breathing on her own, but it's shallow." Another nurse placed a small oxygen mask over Linda's face, carefully adjusting it to fit her small features. A doctor entered, his white coat flaring behind him like a cape. His eyes were sharp, focused. "What's the situation?" he asked. The nurse rattled off Linda's vitals, explaining her condition in rapid medical terms. "She's 27 weeks, born earlier tonight. Declared deceased at 3:22 a.m. Parents say she was in the morgue for over 12 hours. The doctor's eyes snapped to Gina. 12 hours? He asked, disbelief clear in his tone. "She's been in cold storage for 12 hours? Gina could only nod, her eyes wide and filled with tears. "She was cold," Gina said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of it all. "But then, she cried. She opened her eyes and cried." Her knees buckled, and Stephen caught her before she could hit the ground. "I saw her," Gina sobbed into his chest. "I heard her, Stephen. I heard her cry. I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy." The doctor crouched to Gina's level, his face full of something she couldn't quite place: disbelief, awe, maybe even fear. "You're not crazy," he said, his voice softer now. Sometimes things happen that we can't explain." He stood up, his face hardening with determination. "But I can promise you this. We're going to do everything we can to help her now." He glanced back at Linda and barked orders to the nurses. "Warming blankets, IV fluids, get a respiratory specialist in here immediately. I want a full workup, neurological and cardiac assessments." Gina watched them work. Her eyes never left Linda. She stared at her daughter's face, so small and delicate, but so alive. The warmth of hope started to fill her chest, but it was fragile, like thin glass. She didn't know if it would last. "She's going to make it, right?" she asked the doctor, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please tell me she's going to make it." The doctor didn't answer right away. His eyes darted from the heart monitor to the oxygen machine, then back to Linda's face. "She's got a long road ahead," he said cautiously, "but she's a fighter. I can see that already." The minutes dragged on. Every beep from the heart monitor made Gina flinch, her eyes darting to the screen with every sound. Stephen held her hand tightly, his eyes locked on Linda, silently praying. Malcolm stood nearby, pacing back and forth, rubbing his hands together as if trying to ward off the cold. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched, waiting, hoping. Then one of the nurses gasped. "Her oxygen levels are dropping," she called out. The doctor spun around. "What's happening?" His eyes darted to the screen. Linda's oxygen saturation was falling fast. 85, 72, 60. "She's crashing," the nurse shouted. "Her heart rate is dropping." The doctor moved quickly, his hands precise and calm despite the chaos. "Prepare for resuscitation. Charge the defibrillator to 30 joules. "No, no, no, no," Gina cried, shaking her head violently. "Not again! Please, God, not again!" She clutched Stephen's arm so hard that her nails dug into his skin. "Don't let her die! Don't let her die!" Her legs gave out, and she dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Stephen knelt beside her, his face wet with tears. He didn't try to calm her this time. He couldn't. He was just as broken as she was. "Clear!" The doctor's voice cut through the air like a lightning strike. The defibrillator paddles pressed against Linda's tiny chest, and her body jolted. Gina's breath caught in her throat, and she froze, her eyes locked on Linda's tiny frame. Silence. Just the beeping of the monitors. No movement. No change. "No response," the nurse said, her voice low with dread. "Charging again." Gina's eyes widened with panic. "Don't you give up on her!" she screamed. "Don't you dare give up on my baby!" Her voice echoed through the room, sharp and piercing, like the cry of a wounded animal. "Clear," the doctor said again. The jolt came, Linda's tiny body arching on the table. Everyone held their breath. The monitor beeped once, then again, and again. The rhythm returned. The nurse's eyes widened, her face lighting up with relief. "We've got a pulse," she shouted. Gina collapsed into Stephen's arms, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. "Thank you, God," she whispered, her face buried in his chest. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Stephen held her close, his own tears soaking into her hair. Malcolm wiped his face roughly, sniffling hard to hold himself together. The nurse looked at Gina, her eyes full of quiet admiration. "Your little girl's a fighter," she said, "just like her mama." Hours later, Linda lay in a clear incubator, her tiny chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Her skin had a warmer tone now, no longer the cold, grayish color it had been before. Gina sat next to the incubator, her eyes fixed on her baby girl. Her hand rested on the plastic shell, her fingers tracing small circles on the surface. "You did good, baby girl," she whispered. "You did real good." She glanced over her shoulder at Stephen and Malcolm. They sat nearby, exhaustion weighing them down, but their eyes stayed on Linda. None of them could look away. For the first time in hours, Gina exhaled deeply, her chest no longer so tight. The storm of fear still swirled in her heart, but for now there was calm. Linda was alive. She was breathing. She was here. A nurse came over with a clipboard. "We're going to run some tests," she explained. "Her time in the morgue? Well, we just need to be sure everything's okay. Her brain, her lungs, everything. It's routine, but it's necessary." Gina nodded, her eyes never leaving Linda. "Do what you have to do," she said. "Just take care of her, please." The nurse placed a gentle hand on Gina's shoulder. "We will," she promised. "She's safe now. She's in good hands." Gina nodded, letting those words sink in. Safe. For now, that was enough. The steady hum of the ventilator echoed softly through the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, blending with the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. Gina sat in the stiff plastic chair beside Linda's incubator, her eyes fixed on her daughter's tiny body. The clear plastic barrier between them felt like an uncrossable wall, but her fingers still traced gentle circles on the glass. Linda's chest rose and fell steadily, though every movement felt like a small miracle. Her little hands were balled into fists, her fingers twitching occasionally. Her soft brown skin had regained some warmth, no longer the cold, lifeless shade it had been in the morgue. Gina stared at her daughter with a quiet, unshakable determination in her eyes. Her baby was alive. She was still here. That had to mean something. Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. Turning her head, she spotted Stephen approaching with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep, and his hoodie hung from his shoulders like a heavy weight. He handed one of the cups to Gina without a word and sat in the chair next to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with exhaustion, fear, and something else, hope. Gina took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding her in reality. She needed to stay alert. Linda needed her. "You should get some rest," Stephen said, glancing at her with tired eyes. "You've been up all night. You're still healing, Gina. You just had a baby. You can't push yourself like this." His voice was soft, but there was a firmness in his tone. He wasn't wrong. Gina knew she should lie down, let her body recover, but the idea of leaving Linda's side for even a second was unbearable. She shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the incubator. "I'm not leaving her," she replied, her voice low but firm. "Not again. I wasn't there when she was born, Stephen. I wasn't awake to see her take her first breath, and I wasn't awake to see them take her away from me. I'm not leaving her now." Her fingers pressed against the glass as she leaned forward, her eyes locked on her baby girl. "She's been through too much alone. I'm not letting her be alone again." Her voice cracked at the end, and she bit her lip to hold back the sob threatening to escape. Stephen ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. "I get it, I do. he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "But you need to be strong for her. If you fall apart now, who's going to be there for her? You have to take care of yourself too, Gina." His words hung in the air like fog, heavy and hard to shake off. She knew he was right, but logic didn't matter when it came to her baby. She had already lost Linda once. She wasn't taking that chance again. A nurse approached them, her soft smile doing little to mask the seriousness in her eyes. Her name tag read Nurse Danielle, and she had been one of the more kind and patient nurses they'd met. She glanced at Linda's vitals on the monitor, nodding to herself before turning to Gina and Stephen. "She's stable for now," Danielle said, her voice calm and professional. "Her oxygen levels are good, and her heart rate is steady. That's a good sign." Gina sat up straighter, her heart lifting just a little at the news. "Stable is good," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Stable is good." But she wasn't naive. She knew how fragile stable could be. It could change in a second, and that second could take everything from her. "What's next?" Gina asked, turning to Nurse Danielle. "What happens now?" Danielle's face softened, but there was a seriousness in her eyes that Gina didn't miss. "We're going to run a full neurological assessment," she explained. "Her time in the morgue, it's a concern. We need to make sure her brain activity is normal and that there aren't any signs of oxygen deprivation. We'll also do some imaging on her lungs since she's had difficulty breathing on her own." She hesitated before adding, "It's going to be a long process, Gina. I just want you to prepare yourself for that." Gina nodded slowly, her heart sinking at the nurse's words. She hated the idea of preparing herself for bad news, but she knew she had to face it. "Do whatever you have to do," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just keep her alive." Danielle gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before walking away, leaving Gina and Stephen alone again. Hours passed like days. Every beep of the machines felt like a warning. Every nurse that entered the room made Gina hold her breath, fearing they were bringing bad news. Malcolm arrived later in the day, carrying bags of food and snacks from a nearby convenience store. He placed them on the small table near the chairs and sat beside Stephen. The two men didn't speak much, but their presence was enough to make Gina feel a little less alone. At one point, Stephen left to take a phone call and Malcolm stayed behind with Gina. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Linda. "She's strong," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "Look at her, Gina. She's fighting." He shook his head with a small, amazed smile. "That's you right there. You're a fighter, and now she's a fighter too." Gina looked at him, her eyes filling with tears she didn't want to shed. She nodded slowly, her chest tightening with a mixture of pride and pain. "Yeah," she whispered. "She's a fighter." Just then, the heart monitor let out a sharp, rapid beeping sound. Gina's heart stopped. She shot up from her chair, her eyes locked on the screen. The numbers flashed in red, heart rate dropping, oxygen saturation falling. "No," Gina gasped, her voice shaken with terror. "No, no, no!" Nurses rushed in, their faces calm but focused. "What's happening?" Gina yelled, her voice wild with panic. "What's wrong with her? What's happening to my baby?" "She's experiencing respiratory distress," one of the nurses said quickly. "We need to intubate her. Call respiratory." Gina's legs went weak and she felt Malcolm's arms catch her before she collapsed. Her eyes stayed glued to Linda as the nurses surrounded her, moving with quick, practiced precision. Tubes were inserted, the machines whirred louder, and the doctor entered with a focused intensity that sent a chill down Gina's spine. Her whole body shook as she clung to Malcolm. Please, she sobbed. Please don't take her from me again. Her voice cracked, raw and broken. Her heart ached with the familiar suffocating pain she had felt in the morgue. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She clutched Malcolm's hoodie like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She's strong, Gina, Malcolm said, his voice steady and sure. She's strong, just like you said. She's not given up. She didn't give up in that morgue, and she's not given up now. Clear the airway, a nurse shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. They tilted Linda's head and inserted a breathing tube. The sound of the ventilator changed, the whoosh of air louder now. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Everyone watched. Every eye in the room was locked on Linda. Her chest rose, then it fell. Then it rose again. Her heart rate steadied. The beeping on the monitor became consistent, steady, steady. Gina's legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, her body racked with sobs. This time, she wasn't crying from pain. She was crying from relief. Stephen ran back into the room, his phone forgotten in his hand. He saw Gina on the ground, and his eyes darted to Linda. When he saw her chest rising and falling, his breath hitched. He knelt beside Gina, wrapping his arms around her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their baby was still here. She was still fighting. Gina wiped her face, her breath still uneven. She rose to her feet slowly, her hands pressed against the glass of the incubator. "You hear me, baby girl?" she whispered. "You're a fighter, Linda. You hear me? You keep fighting, baby. Mommy's right here." Her fingers traced the outline of Linda's face on the other side of the glass. Her little girl's eyes were closed, her breathing slow but steady. "You keep fighting, baby girl," Gina repeated, her voice stronger this time, "because I'm not going anywhere." The soft hum of the ventilator echoed steadily, a constant reminder of the fragile balance between life and death. Gina sat in the same chair she had occupied for days, her fingers pressed lightly against the glass of the incubator. Her eyes never left Linda's small body. Her little girl lay so still, her chest rising and falling with each assisted breath from the machine. Every second felt like an eternity. Gina's heart clenched tighter with each beep of the monitor. The fear never went away, no matter how many times she told herself to just breathe or stay calm. Her hands trembled in her lap as she whispered, "You're doing so good, baby girl. Mommy's right here. I'm not going anywhere." Stephen sat beside her, his head tilted back, eyes closed, but Gina knew he wasn't asleep. His face was tense, his brows pulled together like he was having a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His hoodie was pulled up, his hands buried in the front pocket. He hadn't spoken much that day. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of someone who had nothing left to say because words wouldn't change anything. The past few days had been an endless cycle of fear, hope, and exhaustion. Linda's oxygen levels had stabilized, but the damage from the oxygen deprivation in the morgue lingered like a shadow. The doctors were blunt but careful in their wording. "Her brain activity is limited," one doctor had said during a meeting with Gina and Stephen. "Only about 10% of her neurological functions seem intact." Gina's heart had shattered all over again at those words. She remembered gripping the edge of the table so hard her nails dug into the wood. Her eyes stung with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "So, what are you saying?" she had asked, her voice sharp, like she was daring him to say something worse. The doctor had glanced at his clipboard, then looked at her with sympathy, that kind of look people give when they've already decided you should give up. I'm saying it's unlikely she'll be able to walk, speak, or recognize faces. It's a hard reality, Mrs. Harris, but I believe it's one you need to prepare for." "Prepare for what exactly?" Gina had snapped, her eyes blazing with rage. "Prepare to give up on my child? Prepare to accept that she's less than whole just because you say so?" She had stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. "No, I'm not preparing for that. I'm preparing for her to live. That's all you need to worry about, keeping her alive. I'll handle the rest." Those words stayed with her now as she watched Linda's little chest rise and fall. Gina's eyes stayed locked on her daughter, her mind replaying everything the doctor had said. Only 10% brain function. No walking, no talking, no "Mommy, I love you." The weight of it pressed down on her chest until it hurt to breathe, but she refused to give in to despair. "You're wrong," she whispered under her breath, her fingers lightly tapping on the glass. "You don't know my baby like I do. You're wrong." Her phone buzzed on the chair arm beside her. Gina glanced at it, half expecting bad news, but it was just a message from Malcolm. "How's she doing? Y'all good?" Gina typed back quickly. "She's stable, still breathing on her own." It felt good to write those words, breathing on her own. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She glanced at Stephen, who was still leaning back with his eyes closed. She nudged him gently. "Malcolm says hi," she said softly. Stephen opened one eye, glanced at her, and gave a weak smile. "Tell him to bring real food next time," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion. Gina smiled, the brief moment of humor lightening the crushing weight on her heart, if only for a second. She sent Malcolm a quick follow-up message. "Bring real food. Stephen's tired of chips and soda." A few seconds later, Malcolm replied with a laughing emoji and, on it, suddenly, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor changed. The beeps quickened, faster, sharper. Gina froze. Her eyes darted to the screen. Her heart stopped. The oxygen levels were dropping. 92. 86. 72. Her breath hitched and her eyes snapped to Linda. The color in her daughter's face shifted from soft brown to pale gray in a matter of seconds. Her chest movements slowed, then stopped. "No!" Gina gasped, shooting up from her chair. "No, no, no, no! Somebody help! Help!" Her scream cut through the air like a knife. Nurses burst into the room, their faces tight with focus. The beeping of the alarm grew louder, faster, more urgent. Gina backed up, her hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with terror. "She's crashing! Do something!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. "Bag her!" a nurse shouted. Another nurse grabbed a small bag valve mask and pressed it over Linda's face, squeezing it in a rhythmic pattern to force oxygen into her lungs. The doctor stormed in moments later, his eyes sharp, his jaw clenched. "What happened?" he demanded, already scanning the vitals. "Saturations dropping fast. Cardiac arrest possible. Prepare for compressions." Gina's back hit the wall. Her whole body felt numb. Her legs wouldn't move. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. "Please," she whispered, "please don't take her from me again." Her voice cracked like shattered glass. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, unable to tear her eyes away from Linda's lifeless body. "Charge in paddles," one of the nurses said, and another nurse wheeled in the defibrillator. The doctor positioned the small pediatric pads on Linda's chest. "Clear!" he shouted. The jolt came, and Linda's small body jerked violently on the table. Gina flinched, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image of her baby's body convulsing was burned into her mind. "Still no pulse," a nurse called out. charging again. 30 joules. Clear. The doctor pressed the button, and Linda's body jolted again. Gina held her breath, eyes locked on the heart monitor. Silence. For a moment, all she could hear was the hum of the machines. And then, beep, beep, beep. Her heart leapt. "She's back," one of the nurses said. "We've got a pulse, steady rhythm." The relief was like a flood. Gina crumpled to the floor, her whole body shaking with sobs. Stephen pulled her into his arms, his hands rubbing her back as she broke down completely. She gripped his hoodie, her face pressed against his chest. "I can't do this anymore," she wept. "I can't lose her again. I can't. I won't survive it." "You're not gonna lose her," Stephen whispered, his own voice raw with emotion. "She's a fighter, Gina, just like you." For the next several hours, Gina didn't leave Linda's side. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She sat there, her hands pressed against the glass, her eyes locked on her baby girl. Nurses checked in periodically, offering food and water, but Gina refused. Her eyes never moved. She was terrified that if she blinked, something would go wrong. When the doctor finally returned, he pulled up a chair next to Gina. "We need to talk about her prognosis," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Her brain scans show signs of severe oxygen deprivation. There's a chance of long-term developmental issues, cognitive delays, motor function loss. It's something we have to prepare for." Gina didn't even flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on Linda. "I'm not preparing for anything but life," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I'm not giving up on her, and I don't want you to give up on her either." The doctor nodded slowly, respecting her resolve. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said. "But you need to be ready for the possibility that things won't be the same." Gina tilted her head toward him, her eyes sharp and full of quiet defiance. "They never were," she replied. "But she's still here. That's all that matters." Her gaze returned to Linda, her voice softening into a whisper. "You hear me, baby girl? You're still here. You're still fighting. So I'm not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Her fingers pressed against the glass, and for a moment, she swore she saw Linda's little fingers twitch in response. "That's it, baby girl," she whispered, her heart swelling with love and fierce determination. "You keep fighting, because I'm fighting right here with you." The weight of exhaustion settled heavily on Gina's shoulders as she sat in the stiff hospital chair, her gaze fixed on the clear incubator where Linda lay. Her eyes were red and swollen from days of crying, and her body ached with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. Her hands pressed firmly against the incubator's surface, her fingers slowly tracing invisible patterns on the... It was the only way she could feel close to her daughter. Her daughter, who had been declared dead, placed in a cold morgue, and now lay breathing right in front of her. Linda's tiny chest rose and fell steadily, each breath like a whispered reminder that she was still here, still fighting. Tubes ran from her nose, her arms, and her legs, connecting her to machines that beeped and whirred with mechanical precision. Her small brown face was calm, her eyes closed in what looked like peaceful sleep, but Gina knew better. Every breath Linda took was a fight. Every twitch of her tiny hands was a battle won. Stephen sat beside Gina, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on Linda with the same intensity as Gina's. His hoodie was wrinkled, his jeans stained with coffee, and his beard was unkempt. He hadn't left her side, not since the last emergency with Linda's heart. They had both been too afraid to leave, too afraid to look away for even a second. 1 second could change everything. 1 second could mean everything. Her vitals are holding steady, Nurse Danielle said as she walked in, her voice quiet but reassuring. She approached the incubator, her movements careful and deliberate. She checked the heart monitor, adjusted the oxygen flow, and glanced at the notes on her clipboard. "She's doing better than expected, Gina. We're not out of the woods, but it's progress." "Better isn't enough," Gina muttered, her eyes still glued to Linda. "Better can turn into worse in a heartbeat." Her voice was sharp, rough from lack of sleep and the constant weight of fear. She glanced at Danielle, her eyes hard and focused. "I need her to be safe. I need her to be okay. I need more than better." Danielle gave her a small, sad smile. "I know," she said softly, "but you're doing everything you can. And so is she. Your baby girl is stronger than anyone here." She adjusted the position of Linda's oxygen tube, glancing over at Gina. "You should try to rest, though. Even the strongest moms need rest." Gina didn't answer. Her eyes flicked back to Linda, her jaw tight with resolve. Rest? There would be no rest until Linda was in her arms at home where she belonged. Rest could wait. Right now, she needed to watch, to be there, to make sure nothing happened. The hours crawled by slowly, each second stretching longer than the last. Gina sat perfectly still, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the side of the incubator. Her mind was loud, full of fear, hope, and unanswered prayers. Her eyes stayed locked on Linda, afraid that if she looked away, she would miss something. Her phone buzzed on the chair next to her. She blinked, snapping out of her trance. It was a message from Malcolm. "How's she doing?" Gina's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before typing back. "Stable, still breathing on her own, taking it day by day." A few moments later, another buzz. "She's a warrior, just like her mama." Gina's lips twitched into a small smile. She glanced at Stephen, who was still sitting with his head in his hands. "Malcolm says she's a warrior," Gina said softly. Stephen lifted his head, his eyes red with exhaustion, but a faint smile touched his lips. "She is," he muttered, his eyes drifting back to Linda. "She definitely is." They sat in silence for a long time after that, listening to the hum of the machines, watching Linda's small body move with every breath. It was a fragile kind of peace, a delicate quiet that could shatter at any moment. Then, without warning, the peace broke. The heart monitor let out a sharp, jarring beep. Then another. Faster this time. The beeping sped up, and Gina's heart dropped into her stomach. Her body stiffened, her eyes snapping to the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. "Stephen!" she gasped, her voice rising with panic. "Stephen, look at the monitor!" The numbers flashed in red. Oxygen levels falling fast. 85, 78, 62. Her chest tightened, and her pulse thundered in her ears. She bolted up from the chair, her legs shaky but moving on instinct. "Somebody help!" she screamed, her voice raw and wild. "Help her! She's crashing!" Nurses flooded the room like a wave, their faces masks of calm urgency. Danielle was already at Linda's side, her hands moving quickly as she barked orders to the other nurses. "Suction airway! Intubation kit now!" she shouted. "We're losing her oxygen saturation!" "No, no, no, no," Gina sobbed, gripping the edge of the incubator so hard her fingers ached. "Please, please don't do this. Not again." Tears poured down her face, her entire body trembling as she watched the nurses work. Stephen was behind her, his hands on her shoulders, but she barely registered his presence. Her eyes were locked on Linda, Her baby girl was turning pale, her lips taking on a faint bluish hue. "Intubating now," one of the nurses said as she carefully placed a breathing tube down Linda's throat. The ventilator hissed as it forced air into Linda's tiny lungs. Gina's knees buckled, and Stephen caught her before she could fall. Her chest heaved with panicked breaths, her sobs racking her whole body. "Please, God," she choked out, her voice cracking with pain. "Don't take her from me. Not again. Please, God, please." Her head fell against Stephen's chest and his arms wrapped around her tightly. She shook uncontrollably as the beeping of the heart monitor echoed in her ears like a countdown. Each beep was a knife in her heart. Suddenly, one long, loud, piercing beep filled the room. Gina's eyes shot up, her heart stopping in her chest. The monitor showed a flat line. "No," she shrieked, pushing Stephen away. She ran to the incubator, slamming her hands against the glass. "No, you get her back. You get her back right now." Her scream was wild, full of desperation and rage. "Do not let my baby die." "Charging to 30 joules," Danielle announced, the defibrillator in her hands. She pressed the small pads to Linda's chest. "Clear." The jolt shook Linda's small body, her arms flinching upward. Gina squeezed her eyes shut, her lips pressed together as tears streamed down her face. "Again," Danielle said, her voice steady. "Charging to 50 joules. Clear." The shock hit again, and Linda's body jolted once more. Gina's nails dug into the glass of the incubator, her breath caught in her chest. Silence. Beep. 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 Her heart shattered in relief. The soft, steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the room. Gina sobbed uncontrollably, her hands sliding down the glass until she crumpled to her knees. Stephen knelt beside her, his arms wrapped around her. "She's back," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "She's back, baby. She's still here." Gina tilted her head up, her eyes locked on Linda. Her baby girl's chest rose and fell once more, slowly, steadily. Her lips were no longer blue. Her cheeks had a faint warmth to them. Gina wiped her face with her sleeve, her breath still uneven. She pressed her forehead against the glass of the incubator, her eyes closing in relief. "You did it, baby girl," she whispered. "You did it. You're so strong. You're so strong, baby. I'm so proud of you." Her voice was soft, full of love, full of promise. "I'm never leaving you, Linda," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." She placed her palm against the glass, her eyes watching Linda's chest rise and fall, each breath a victory, each breath a promise. "You hear me, baby girl?" Gina whispered, her voice shaken but strong. "We're not done fighting. Not yet. Not ever." What a powerful story of love, strength, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.